All right, well, thank you for being here with me. I'm gonna start my little timer too, so I don't take too much time. But yes, I am the math department, and I'm gonna be talking about group work on Zoom. Um, so first, I wanna know a little bit about you, and if you have access to the reactions in Zoom, I'm gonna be using those for the next few moments. So first, I want to know, do you use group work in your face-to-face instruction? Give me a thumbs up in the reactions if you can, or you can write into the chat, yes, I do. Awesome. Okay, Shannon, Mariah, Anthony, Tanya, Carol. Okay, awesome. Some of you do. Awesome. Very cool. Okay, so now I'm wondering, how many of you have used breakout groups on Zoom with your remote instruction? Give me a clap, a little clap reaction if you have that. Anyone? Shannon, Carla, Madison, Mariah. Okay, so some of you have. Okay. And then last, how about, have you used the Zoom polling feature with your classes? Give me a thumbs up again if you've used those in your classes. Tanya has. Okay, Carla, Madison, Shannon. Okay, cool. So it seems like a handful of you are really comfortable with some of the features that Zoom uses, and others are kind of new to some of these features. And that's okay. I'm not going to be teaching you so much how to use these features. At the end of my presentation, I have links for you to like go figure out how to use the breakout groups, how to create a poll and things like that. I'm just going to talk about how I use these to facilitate group work in my own classroom. So the first thing I recommend before you start doing your group work and your Zoom meetings is to really get to know how your students are engaging with Zoom, because this is a new classroom setting for all of us. So maybe sending out a survey through Canvas, asking them, you know, how are you accessing Zoom? Is it from your phone or a laptop or a tablet? Do you have a camera? Do you have a microphone? What's your environment like? Are you in an environment free from distractions? Do you have loved ones that you're caring for in the same home as you? Are you competing with others for internet bandwidth? I know some of my friends are actually driving to friends' houses just to use their internet so that way they can get to class. So really get to know how students are engaging with the class, because that makes a huge difference as to how smoothly your class runs. You know, if you make that expectation or assume that students all have a microphone, you're going to be sorely disappointed when you start asking them to contribute via the microphone. Next is to get your students talking. And I like to do this, as I mentioned, I teach math. So that creates a whole set of fears for a lot of students. So I like to get them talking about things that are not math related. One, because it gets them used to interacting in this online classroom. And two, it reminds me that I'm not just teaching to my kitchen and dining table. So I always start class at least once a week with a conversation starter. And so some of my ideas are, you know, what are you binge watching? What's something good that's come from staying at home? What do you like to do to help yourself de-stress? That was my topic of the week this week as we go into finals. And I call on students individually to share their responses. So everyone in class gets a chance to share, and they have the opportunity to share through their microphone, or they can type it into the chat when I call on them. And it's just a great opportunity for me to have a human-to-human experience with my students, which I miss so much from being in the classroom. And so it's helped me out a lot. And I posted a link there shared by my colleague, Shannon, who's here in today's meeting, about 20 questions to ask instead of how are you doing right now, to really get students, you know, sharing and trying to think on the positive. Next, I try to prioritize low stakes collaborative practice in my classroom. And so I try to minimize the amount of lecture that I'm doing and try to get more student engagement. And so as I mentioned, I do this through Zoom breakout groups, Zoom polling, and using some discussion boards on Canvas as well. So first, Zoom breakout groups. What I did is I took the group work that was already happening in my face-to-face class and tried to put it into groups on Zoom, and it adapted pretty well. There's some growing pains and some adjustments that need to be made, but it is possible. Some of the cool features about Zoom breakout groups is that you can randomly assign students to groups, or you can choose who's in which group. And you can adjust the sizes of the group. You know, I like to group my students into groups of 3 or 4 usually, because I think that that encourages the most engagement between students. As a teacher, you can pop into groups. So I can join a breakout group and just my video pops in, I see the students, and I can check to see what they're talking about and see if they have any questions. So I can pop from group to group just like I would in the classroom. I walk around and sit with the group and chat with them about stuff. Something cool that my students figured out that I didn't even know about was that they can request help. Depending on how they're accessing Zoom, again, some of them, when they're in a group, will have an option on the menu that says ask for help. And it sends a notification to me, the host, saying, hey, so-and-so in breakout room 3 needs help. And it pops up on my screen, I click a button and it takes me straight there. So I thought that was a very cool way, like a student raising their hand in class, I can walk over and help them. And then as a teacher, you can also broadcast messages to the entire groups. You know, if you need to refocus them about what question number they're on, or just let them know all something, you can type in a message and it sends it out to all of the groups. Some tips for success. First, the very first time that you do a group session with your class, I really recommend doing something very low stakes. Something where there's no right or wrong answer, something that's very opinion-based. It could even be one of those open-ended, you know, getting to know you questions, icebreaker questions I mentioned earlier, just to get them used to how groups work, like how they'll join a group, what it'll look like when they're in there, and then how they'll be invited back to the main session. I like to make sure that all of my students have a handout that they can use when they're in the groups, because as soon as they leave the general session, they miss everything that they're seeing on the screen. So right now you all see my presentation, but if I put you into breakout groups, the presentation's gone. So I like to post a handout on Canvas ahead of time for students to either download or print. And that way, when they get into the breakout groups, they all have something to look at that has the information they need on it. I encourage, but obviously do not require videos. And then I had to set new norms for when we return from the breakout groups. I expect students to share out. So, you know, before you leave your group and come back to the main session, make sure as a group you've decided on one person that's going to share out what it was you chatted about or what answer you got on that math problem and how you did it. So that way, when we get back to the main session, I could say, okay, group 3 had, you know, these 4 students in it. Who's your ambassador? Let's talk about question number 1. And there's less lag time of me waiting for someone to decide that they want to unmute themselves to talk to us. It's more structured and kind of flows a little bit more smoothly than just asking an open-ended question to the class and not getting much response via the Zoom meeting. And then my last tip for success would be to pause recordings while you're in group, while you're facilitating groups. The recording follows around the host. So if you forget to do it, it will follow you from group to group. And so just for students who watch the recording later, it's a very disjointed way to watch class. It'd be like if they were shadowing you all class, walking with you from group to group. So I usually pause the recording. We do all the group work, and then when we invite students back to the general session, I resume the recording. Next, I'd like to share with you some of my face-to-face strategies that I use and how I've kind of adapted them for Zoom. They actually work pretty well. So one of them is a think, pair, share, which you may be familiar with. But in class, you give students, you know, quiet time to think. You'll ask them to turn to a neighbor and chat for a few moments, and then you'll ask students to share out what they thought. And so in Zoom, usually it works very similarly. I'll post some sort of prompt in the general session, and I'll ask students to quietly reflect on the prompt and maybe have out a scratch piece of paper to take some notes on, jot down some ideas. Maybe it's a math problem they're solving. They're going to walk through the steps on the paper. After a couple of minutes of quiet time, I send them into breakout groups, into pairs. So it's just them and another student. And I ask them to compare answers or share their thoughts. And if they got different answers, talk to each other about how they did it. Or if one person had no clue how to do it, maybe the other person can help out. And so they spend about 2 to 3 minutes in their paired breakout groups. And then I invite them back to the general session. And I ask students to share out. Sometimes I'll ask for volunteers. Other times I'll call on specific students. Obviously setting up the norms that it's okay to say I don't know, and it's okay to say I didn't get to that problem, but just to communicate with me what's going on if I do call on you. Another technique that I use in my face-to-face classes that I've adapted for Zoom is called an ambassador exchange. And so how this works is first you start off with everyone in the class is going to be working on the same problem. And so you break them up into groups of about 3 or 4 students. So I send them off into breakout groups and I say, okay, you're all going to do problem number 1. I give them a couple of minutes to work on problem number 1 with the people in their group. And then after a few minutes, I will shuffle one member from each group into another group. And this is a feature that you have in Zoom where you can move one person to another group. And so, you know, if they were in the yellow group, I send one person from the yellow group to the green group, and one person from the green group to the black group, and one person from the black group to the yellow group. So now everyone has a new visitor, and they're going to chat about how they did the problem in their own group, right? And so the yellow group member would share with the 2 green group members how they did it, and the green group members might compare feedback, you know, and say, oh, well, we did it the same way, or did something a little bit different. Yeah, Mariah's suggesting a discussion board, which is another great way to do this asynchronously. So it is a modified jigsaw, which is my next technique, Mariah. It's like you've seen my presentation. After they've had a chance to meet with their ambassador, I send the ambassador back to their home group, just for them to talk about anything that they may have learned. And maybe the home group members learn something from their visitor as well. So there's a general back and forth of like, oh yeah, we all are on the same track, or oh my gosh, our visitor, our ambassador gave us something totally different to think about. And so I give them a few moments to kind of process what they learned in the ambassador exchange. Last but not least is the jigsaw. And so for a jigsaw, it's very similar to an ambassador exchange, except that now instead of every group working on the same problem, each group is working on a different problem. So I might tell the green group they're responsible for problem number 1, the black group that they're responsible for problem number 2, and the yellow group that they're responsible for problem number 3. And I tell them, I warn them ahead of time that everyone in the group needs to get good enough at what they're working on to be able to teach it to someone else, okay? Not just one person, but everyone in the group. And this is a very important time for me to pop into groups as the facilitator and just check in and say, hey, did you get this answer? Did you meet my expectations for this problem that you're working on? To make sure that they've mastered it and they're on the right track before we move on. It takes a little bit of time, definitely more time than the ambassador exchange. After I've confirmed that each group shows mastery, then I regroup the students so that way one person from each group is now grouped together. And so now I've got someone who's mastered problem number 1, someone who's mastered problem number 2, and someone who's mastered problem number 3, all in a group together. And so they take turns explaining how to do their problem to their new group mates. So it's a great way to get students talking to each other, and really like they have to engage here because they are the only one that knows how to do their problem in the group. So it really, really forces that interaction, but in a very low stakes way. They're not presenting it to the whole class, they're presenting it to 2 other people. So that's what I like about all of these techniques, is that it allows student to student interaction in a small environment rather than a whole class environment. Last but not least is the polling feature on Zoom, which is super awesome. Some of the reasons that I love it is that it's anonymous. You can set it up to be anonymous or not ahead of time, but the anonymity is just for whether the teacher knows after the fact how students responded. no matter how you set it up during the actual poll, no one gets to see what someone else put. So if you choose to make it anonymous or not, it doesn't really matter for the in-class experience. It's more for the out-of-class experience if you as the teacher want to be able to see how, you know, so-and-so responded to problem number 1. The teacher can publish the poll results. So students will click in, and then I'll give students, you know, a time frame. You've got a minute to answer this poll question. And then afterwards, I'll publish the results so they'll see what other people in the class responded with in a summary way, not as an individual way. And another thing that I really, really like about it is I will have more interaction in a poll than I will in like a general class discussion. So if I ask an open-ended question to the class, I get that cricket, that radio silence. But now I've got a situation where I've got more students participating in a poll and actively engaged because they can just click on a couple of buttons. What's really cool as a stats teacher is I can use this to collect data and then use the results later to help, we can analyze it together. Some tips for success on polls is to make sure you set up your polls before the meeting. It's a little clunky to do during the meeting. I don't recommend it. So you do have to have that forethought of what types of questions you want to ask. And then the second part would be in a pinch, if I forgot to make a poll for something and I'm realizing, oh my gosh, I wish I had a poll for this, I'll just have students type into the chat and I'll say, don't press enter yet. Tell me if you think it's A, B, or C. Type it into the chat, but don't press enter. Give everyone a couple seconds to type it in, and then I say, okay, go. And then I see an onslaught of different letters or answer choices. So that's a way to do a kind of poll in a pinch. I see Anthony asked, what's the nature of the problem you assign in a jigsaw? Relatively simple, relatively complex, what type of math? I've been teaching statistics this semester only. I use jigsaws with all of my classes though. So I have used it on the level of like linear algebra before and calculus 1, some other classes I've taught. I've not taught those classes remotely. But during statistics classes, yeah, we do like open-ended word problems. I love to use it to review for an upcoming assessment. So that way they get like to master one problem, but also to hear review from other people. We just did one to help the students prepare for their final. So yeah, I think it's very adaptable. You can use it with any type of subjects. And Mariah's giving you some more tips on how you might use the jigsaw.